everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about audiobooks, the very, very controversial topic that has been on BookTube for several years, and I just want to offer some of my evolving thoughts on this topic. This topic for me was influenced by a couple of videos I saw not too long ago, one being by A.P. Canavan, A Critical Dragon, in which he talked about how he hates audiobooks. I'm just kidding. He didn't say that. He doesn't hate audiobooks, but he made a very strong case for why he thinks the audiobook experience is very, very different than reading with your eyes. And he clearly has a preference for reading with your eyes. And then I also watched a video from a booktuber by the name of Travel Through Stories. He is a medievalist scholar. I just found out about his channel through Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, who shouted him out. He has a fantastic channel, and he talked in his video about why he is a big believer in audiobooks and immersion reading, which is listening to audiobooks and reading with your eyes, and how you can accomplish close reading through the audiobook experience. And he does this with Beowulf and Lolita and Cormac McCarthy books. So I will definitely link both videos down below because I think they're both worth watching. Now, where I land on this topic is, first of all, I want to mention that audiobooks are really, really fantastic for people who don't have access to be able to read with their eyes for various reasons, whether they are blind or visually impaired for any reason, or they might have a busy lifestyle, and that is the only way for them to consume books. Another point I want to bring up too is I feel like that it's interesting. I know that there's a lot of debate about whether listening to audiobooks counts as reading. I don't know exactly where scholars land on this side of the topic, but I can say from being a music educator, it used to be that a lot of scholars in music education would refer to music literacy only as being able to visually read notes and rhythms with your eyes and be able to play them. And now we have a much more broad understanding of what music literacy is. I will go ahead and screenshot and place on screen one researcher's definition of music literacy. So I think this is an evolving topic, defining what literacy means, and I think it could apply to reading literature as well. So I am totally fine if people say I read a book via audiobook. I think it's perfectly fine for my purposes. I know different people have different opinions of that, but I wanted to get that out of the way right here. And I want to give some of my background with audiobooks because I have evolved my thoughts on this topic. So first of all, I was not always a fan of audiobooks. When I started listening to audiobooks, actually, my first audiobook experience was Harry Potter. And this was several years ago on a road trip with my sister who was listening to The Sorcerer's Stone via audio, and I didn't like it at all. I did not like the way the narrator portrayed certain voices. I didn't think it was anywhere near the perfection that my imagination was able to do. So I was not a fan. And she actually listened to the whole entire Harry Potter series via audio. I had already read the books at the time, so I just wasn't a fan. And it wasn't until many years later, I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time, especially when driving to work. And I was listening to a lot of, especially health podcasts, lifestyle podcasts, and some meditation stuff, things nobody here is going to care about. But when listening to a lot of these podcasts, you would often hear an ad for Audible. And so I thought about this because it would be nice to be able to consume books while driving instead of just listening to podcasts. And another thing that really influenced this was actually BookTube, because I discovered BookTube, I guess, around 2018, 2019. And I was surprised how many booktubers out there actually listen to audiobooks. That was an interesting thing to me when I discovered BookTube. People with big channels talked all the time about audiobooks. So I guess it kind of opened my mind to try it again. And when I did, the way I did also actually was through a podcast. I listened to this podcast called LaVon Burton Reads. If you don't know who that is, if you've lived long enough, you might remember reading Rainbow. But he has a podcast, I don't know if he still runs it or not, in which he reads short stories. And he is such a brilliant actor. He did Neil Gaiman's short story Chivalry from Smoke and Mirrors, and it was so good. I was mind blown how much I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And so it made me more open-minded to try a full audiobook, like not just the short story. So I started off with Stephen King's The Gunslinger, which I checked out from my library on CD because I didn't understand anything about Libby or digital databases at the time, and then moved on from there to Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane, narrated by him. And but to this day, that is one of my favorite audiobooks of all time. It completely captivated me. It completely captivated me to the point where I am convinced that I would not love the book as much if I read it with my own eyes. And that was a huge leap for me in my evolving thoughts on audiobooks. So over time, I have been an audiobook listener, but what I have found is that it is greatly dependent on many things, whether I will enjoy an audiobook. One is genre, even though I did mention The Gunslinger and The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which are fantasy. For the most part, I don't prefer listening to fantasy audiobooks unless I'm immersion reading, which means reading with my eyes and listening, because I just feel like fantasy, there are so many abstract things in fantasy that are not of our world that you kind of have to hold in your mind. And I just can't do it very well via audiobook. So for me, the best genres for me to consume audiobooks are mystery thrillers or contemporary books, those kinds of books, or nonfiction books. And I actually don't really listen to a lot of those these days. I just haven't gravitated towards those genres. But I do find that those ones do lend themselves really well to audiobook listening. Sometimes historical fiction works as well. And so genre is a big factor, but another huge factor here is the narrator. And I know everyone's going to agree with me about this, as much as we all love Stephen Pacey, the audiobook narrator of Joe Abercrombie's books. He is fantastic. He just brings those characters to life like no other narrator in existence, in my opinion. And so the audiobook narrator can dramatically affect things, both in good and bad ways. And this is where I want to circle to some points from the videos I mentioned at the beginning. One thing that I agree with AP Canavan is that when you're listening to an audiobook, you are only kind of given one sense of inflection and tone with one narrator. And so that can be kind of challenging because you might be cheated a little bit in how the interpretation is that you're given. And one example of this is that I noticed that one time I listened to an audiobook that I really enjoyed, only to later hear the author say that that particular audiobook narrator didn't quite portray one of the voices of the characters quite right. And I felt like I was cheated at that point because I loved it. So I feel like I felt as though I didn't experience the story in the right way. And yes, I could have misread it even just with my eyes, but at least with your eyes, you have the option to kind of go back. If you have access to reading with your eyes, you kind of can play with that aspect. I think it can be kind of tricky to separate the audiobook narrator from the story and understand too. So this is my second point, understand whether it's the audiobook narrator that is making you not quite gel with the story, or if it's the book itself. And so an example of this is that there was a book I read a few years ago. I won't mention the book's name here, but I read this book a few years ago, and I noticed on BookTube that anytime I watched a review in which the person listened to the audiobook, they often left a negative review, and those that read it with their eyes loved the book. So it made me wonder whether the audiobook narrator was somehow not working for people and they weren't aware of that. There's no way to test that. There's no way to isolate that variable. But I just found it very interesting that that was the case. So audiobook narrators can definitely play a role in how you interpret the characters, the tone, the inflection. And like I said, you might do that too. You're going to do that too with your own internal narrator when you read visually. But like I said, I feel like you have a little more agency when you're able to do it on your own because you're able to kind of reread and play with the interpretation. So that's something to think about. Another thing I want to mention too is that I personally believe that listening to audiobooks is a skill. Now, with that said, yes, some people, it will be much easier for some people than others. Some people can easily listen to an audiobook at 2 times speed and comprehend everything that they're listening to without any problem at all while they're driving or cooking or whatever. And other people might listen to an audiobook and just feel lost even at one time speed. And I have had that experience myself with certain audiobooks, depending on, again, on the narrator, on the genre, all types of factors. And I have found, at least in my case, that audiobook listening is a skill that can be developed. Now, whether you want to develop it or not, that's up to you. I won't judge you if you don't want to, but I do think it's worthwhile and it's nice to have options. Like with music education, I think it's very nice if you're able to not only play the notes that you see on a page, but also be able to play by ear. I think that's a great skill to have. Of course, I know that not everybody is consuming books for that reason, to build skills in that regard. So disregard that if that's not interesting to you, but I do think it is a skill that can be developed. Another video I should go ahead and mention is Joanna Sousa's video on this topic, in which she talks about immersion reading, which is to listen to the audiobook while you're reading with your eyes. And she talked about how, as a non-native speaker of English, sometimes that could be really helpful for her. And so that's something that might be helpful for other people too, is to have this experience of immersion reading if you're able to. But again, if you prefer to just listen to audiobooks or read with your eyes or immersion reading, it doesn't matter. It's just that you're enjoying the stories, right? One last thing I guess I'll mention, as for me personally, is that mood for me plays a role. So sometimes I'm in the mood to listen to an audiobook and sometimes I'm not. So I think mood can also affect our experience of whether we're enjoying listening to a book versus reading with our eyes. But that's just another factor to offer into this discussion. And now I want to hear from you. Do you have any audiobook recommendations for me? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Maybe I'll take you up on your recommendations if you have them. Do you have a favorite narrator? Do you find the narrator affects your experience? And one more question I have, if you're willing to answer it, if the narrator isn't working for you, do you find you can kind of make a separation in your mind and know that it's the narrator and not quite the book? I'm just curious. I still have evolving thoughts on this topic. I am going to have a guest on my channel to discuss this topic as well as some other things in my next video, so please keep your eyes out for that. Thank you so much for watching. Leave me your audiobook recommendations down in the comment section below, or if you don't listen to audiobooks, just let me know your thoughts on this topic in general. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.